It often begins as a tightening before a sound, a fraction of a second where the chest braces, not from fear exactly, but from anticipation. The body prepares for friction before it arrives. Shoulders rise slightly. Breath shortens. The nervous system adjusts its posture without asking permission. There is a familiar sensation of being slightly out of sync with the room. Conversations continue. Laughter lands. But something inside stays alert, scanning for shifts in tone, glances that linger a beat too long, silences that stretch just enough to mean something. Not danger, judgment, or the possibility of it. Muscles hold tension long after it's useful. The jaw stays engaged even when no words are spoken. The eyes track reactions rather than faces. This isn't anxiety in its loud form. It's quieter, more disciplined. A background hum of readiness that never fully powers down. Over time, this state feels normal. The body forgets it's bracing. Hyper-awareness becomes baseline awareness. Calm is defined not by ease, but by the absence of immediate friction. When nothing goes wrong, relief comes, not peace. There's often a moment, brief and easy to miss, when connection seems possible. A laugh almost shared. A comment that could soften the space. And then the body interrupts. A subtle withdrawal. A tone held flatter than intended. The system chooses containment over exposure, not because of what just happened, but because of what might. From the outside, nothing appears wrong. Inside, regulation is constantly negotiated. Energy is spent before anything occurs. The cost is paid in advance. And somewhere beneath all of this is an unasked question the body keeps preparing for, even when no one else seems to be asking it. From the outside, this state is rarely interpreted as regulation. It's translated into character. People reach for simple labels because ambiguity is uncomfortable. Aloof, arrogant, difficult. The kind of person who rubs everyone the wrong way, as if irritation were a contagious property rather than a reaction. In many social systems, ease is treated as virtue. The individual who doesn't mirror tone, soften edges, or modulate themselves for group comfort is seen as violating an unspoken contract. Historically, communities have always marked those who disrupt emotional symmetry. The court eccentric, the blunt truth-teller, the figure who refuses ritual politeness. What changes is the language, not the reaction. In modern settings, this misreading becomes faster and harsher. Group chats go quiet after a message lands too directly. Meetings tense when someone doesn't perform reassurance alongside competence. Social media rewards emotional fluency, not emotional restraint. When someone doesn't offer warmth on schedule, absence is interpreted as intent. Observers assume malice where there is often management. They read control as coldness, reserve as superiority, silence as judgment. The system prefers visible signals of safety, and when those signals aren't expressed, threat is inferred, even if none is present. This misunderstanding compounds because it feeds itself. Once the label is applied, confirmation follows. Neutral actions are filtered through expectation. A short response becomes dismissive. A boundary becomes hostility. A lack of explanation becomes a power move. The individual is now reacting inside a story they didn't write. What remains invisible is the effort underneath, the continuous monitoring, the restraint required to prevent missteps, the internal calculations happening in real time to avoid escalating friction. None of that registers externally. Only the absence of ease does. So the distance grows, others pull away first, convinced they're responding to something obvious, and the person at the center absorbs the message without ever hearing the full accusation, only its consequences. What no one accounts for is what it costs to be interpreted this way repeatedly, long before anyone asks why it keeps happening. Over time, the strain doesn't arrive as a crisis. It accumulates as erosion. Small withdrawals from an internal reserve that is never fully replenished. The system stays vigilant, even in neutral spaces, because past experience has taught it that neutrality rarely stays neutral for long. In professional environments, this shows up as a constant readiness to justify presence. Emails are reread not for clarity but for tone leakage. Meetings are endured with the body half focused on content, half tracking how statements might land. The work itself is rarely the heaviest load. It's the monitoring layered on top of it. Performance plus containment, output plus self-surveillance. Relationally, the cost is quieter but heavier. Conversations become strategic without conscious intent. Disclosure is filtered, emotional range is narrowed to avoid misinterpretation. Even moments of genuine connection carry an undercurrent of restraint, as if closeness must be carefully rationed to prevent backlash. Over time, this creates a strange fatigue. Not loneliness exactly, but the exhaustion of being partially present everywhere. In solitude, the nervous system doesn't immediately relax. Silence doesn't equal safety. The internal machinery keeps running, replaying past interactions, scanning for missed signals, recalibrating future responses. Rest becomes a task that requires permission the body doesn't easily grant. Sleep, when it comes, is shallow or segmented, as if the system refuses to fully stand down. What drains energy isn't conflict itself, but anticipation. The expectation of friction shapes posture before friction appears. This chronic readiness consumes metabolic resources, cognitive bandwidth, emotional flexibility. Over months and years, it narrows tolerance. Irritation surfaces faster. Detachment deepens. The internal world becomes smaller, not by choice, but by conservation. There is also a subtler loss, curiosity. When so much energy is spent preventing misunderstanding, little remains for exploration. New environments feel expensive. New relationships feel risky. Novelty is assessed not for interest, but for potential cost. This depletion often gets mistaken for personality change. But it isn't a shift in desire. It's a system adapting to repeated outcomes, learning that exposure carries a price. And the most unsettling part is that the body doesn't treat this drain as an error. It treats it as necessary. At a certain point, explanation becomes unavoidable. Not explanation as defense, but as physiology. What's unfolding here is not a social flaw, but a predictive system doing its job too well. The brain is not reacting to the present moment alone. It is weighting probability based on accumulated outcomes. Neural circuitry evolved to anticipate threat doesn't differentiate cleanly between physical danger and social exclusion. Both register as survival relevant. When prior experiences repeatedly pair authenticity with rejection, the system updates its model. Expression becomes risk. Visibility becomes exposure. The body learns faster than language can keep up. This is not conscious strategy, it's prediction. The autonomic wiring begins to favour containment because containment has historically reduced cost. Muscles tighten not to intimidate, but to stabilise. Emotional range narrows not from indifference, but from an economy of resources. The system is optimising for fewer losses, not greater connection. From a behavioural standpoint, this creates a paradox. The more the system protects itself, the less it broadcasts the signals others rely on to feel safe. Facial neutrality reads as disinterest. Measured speech reads as judgment. Reduced reactivity reads as superiority. The protective mechanism itself becomes the trigger for further social friction, reinforcing the original prediction. Neuroscience calls this a feedback loop, but lived experience feels more like inevitability. Each interaction subtly confirms the model. Each misunderstanding sharpens the prediction. Over time, the threshold for perceived threat lowers, not because the world becomes harsher, but because the system becomes faster. What's critical here is that nothing about this process requires intent. No one is choosing to be misread. No one is choosing to withdraw warmth. The system is responding to statistical regularities, not moral ones. It is doing exactly what adaptive organisms do, reducing exposure to known costs. But this explanation still leaves something unresolved. If the mechanism is adaptive, if it is functioning as designed, why does its outcome feel so internally expensive? Why does protection slowly turn into isolation if the system's goal is survival? The circuitry can explain how this pattern forms. It cannot yet explain why it keeps extracting more than it preserves. This is not unlikability. It is a nervous system calibrated around minimizing social volatility. This is not a personality that repels, it is an identity shaped by repeated evidence that exposure carries cost. What others experience as distance is, internally, regulation. A narrowing of expression designed to keep the environment predictable. A reduction in signal to reduce reaction. The confusion comes from language. Social groups talk about warmth and likability as traits, as if they originate from character. But what's operating here is closer to a control system. When earlier attempts at openness resulted in friction, the system didn't interpret that as bad luck. It encoded it as pattern, and patterns alter behaviour long before beliefs do, so the self reorganises, not consciously, not ideologically. The body learns which versions of expression escalate tension and which reduce it. Over time, the safer version becomes dominant, humour becomes drier, affect becomes flatter, boundaries become firmer sometimes before they're needed. None of this is about superiority or contempt, it's about load management. This is not emotional absence, it is emotional compression. Feeling is still there, but it's held under tighter control, because uncontrolled feeling once led to unpredictable outcomes. The system doesn't forget that lesson, it generalizes it. What gets labelled as hard to like is often a system that has stopped advertising itself freely. Signals are minimized, variability is reduced. The person becomes legible only at close range, if at all. From afar, neutrality gets mistaken for rejection. And here's where tension forms. The same mechanism that protects against repeated social injury also erodes the feedback loops that create belonging. The system survives by limiting exposure. The self, however, experiences the narrowing. Protection works, but it works by shrinking the space in which the self can safely exist. And that raises a quieter conflict, whether survival through reduction slowly costs more than it saves, even when it's functioning exactly as designed. Once this regulatory style is in place, it doesn't stay confined to one domain. It migrates. The same predictive logic begins to organize experience across unrelated contexts, each time adding pressure without announcing itself. At work, the pattern often expresses as hyper-precision. Communication becomes carefully engineered to prevent misreading. Statements are technically correct, emotionally sparse. Feedback is delivered without cushioning. This reduces ambiguity, but it also reduces affiliative signal. Colleagues respond with distance, which confirms the system's original prediction. Warmth invites complication. Neutrality keeps things contained. The loop closes quietly. In collaborative spaces, especially creative ones, the cost sharpens. Brainstorming requires provisional ideas, half-formed thoughts, emotional risk. A system trained to minimize exposure hesitates here. Ideas are held back until fully defensible. Spontaneity is filtered out. Others read this as disengagement or arrogance, unaware that restraint is doing protective labor. The room moves faster without waiting. The distance widens. In intimate relationships, the pattern becomes heavier. Emotional disclosure is monitored for downstream consequences. Even affection is calibrated. Too much intensity feels dangerous. Too little invites accusation. The body aims for equilibrium, but equilibrium here is defined by not triggering rejection, not by closeness. Partners sense something withheld but cannot name it. Tension accumulates in the absence of visible conflict. Health behaviours are not immune. Chronic vigilance keeps the stress response partially activated. Recovery signals, deep rest, full relaxation, are delayed or truncated. The system struggles to fully downshift because unpredictability feels safer than vulnerability. Over time, this manifests as exhaustion, without clear cause, sleep that doesn't restore, a body that feels on even when nothing is required. Social settings add another layer. Group environments demand rapid emotional attunement, jokes, micro-reassurances, shared affect. A restrained system can't keep up without cost, so it opts out subtly. Less eye contact, shorter attendance, earlier exits. Others interpret withdrawal as disinterest or disdain. The system records this as further evidence that presence leads to misalignment. Even in solitude, the pattern persists. The mind rehearses conversations that never happened. It simulates future interactions, searching for errors before they occur. This isn't rumination for its own sake. It's rehearsal driven by a predictive model that expects friction. Quiet becomes another workspace for vigilance. Across these domains, the same structure repeats. Anticipation leads to restraint. Restraint leads to misinterpretation. Misinterpretation leads to confirmation. Each context feels separate, but the underlying logic is shared. The system isn't reacting to people, projects, or places individually. It's responding to probability estimates carried forward from earlier experience. What's striking is how invisible this pattern feels from the inside. It doesn't announce itself as avoidance. It presents as reasonableness, as efficiency, as emotional maturity. It feels like control, not loss. Only when the outcomes line up, workplaces that feel cold, relationships that feel distant, bodies that feel perpetually braced, does a question begin to surface. Why does the same outcome keep appearing in different forms? Why does connection keep thinning across unrelated areas, even when intention hasn't changed? At some point, the repetition becomes hard to ignore, not as a failure, but as a signature, a survival strategy leaving identical traces wherever it operates. And the system, still doing its job, doesn't recognize this repetition as a signal to stop, only as further proof that its predictions were accurate all along. Every survival strategy extracts payment, not immediately, not in ways that trigger alarms. The cost arrives slowly, disguised as trade-offs that once seemed reasonable. In the short term, restraint works. Fewer misunderstandings, less overt conflict, a sense of control over social exposure. The system experiences this as relief. Tension drops just enough to reinforce the behaviour. But relief is not restoration. It's merely the absence of acute threat, not the presence of safety. Over time, the trade-off becomes clearer. Relationships stabilize at a lower emotional temperature. They function, but without elasticity. There is less rupture, but also less repair. Without repair, bonds stop deepening. They hover at a functional distance that prevents collapse but also prevents richness. The system survives, but connection plateaus. Cognitively, this strategy sharpens certain capacities while dulling others. Precision improves, pattern detection strengthens, but flexibility erodes. The nervous system grows efficient at anticipating rejection, not at metabolizing closeness. When something unexpected arrives, genuine warmth, unambiguous acceptance, it can feel disorganizing rather than soothing. The system doesn't have a practiced response for safety that doesn't require vigilance. Emotionally, there is a narrowing, not numbness, but compression. Feelings are experienced, then quickly contained. Over years, this containment reduces internal contrast. Highs feel muted, lows feel controlled but persistent. The emotional landscape flattens, not because intensity vanished, but because expression was repeatedly taxed. There is also a reputational cost that compounds silently. Once the environment learns to expect distance, it stops offering invitations that might contradict that expectation. Opportunities disappear without confrontation. Social ecosystems self-organize around the signals they receive. The individual isn't excluded dramatically, they're simply no longer considered. What makes this trade-off unavoidable is timing. The strategy formed to prevent loss. It succeeded early. Only later does the cumulative cost reveal itself, when the system is already organized around it. By then, the absence of connection feels familiar, predictable, even safe. And that familiarity is the most expensive part. Because the longer the system survives this way, the more foreign alternative states become, states that would require tolerating exactly the unpredictability this strategy was built to avoid. The adaptation continues to function. The body stays regulated, the world stays manageable. But something remains unresolved. Whether a system designed to prevent social injury can recognize on its own when the protection itself has become the primary source of loss. There is no clear ending to this pattern. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't resolve. It simply settles into the background. Like a low-frequency hum, the system stops questioning. The body continues to regulate for a world that feels statistically unwelcoming, even when no immediate evidence confirms it. Neutral expressions are maintained. Emotional output stays measured. The system keeps choosing predictability over risk, not because it is certain rejection will occur, but because uncertainty itself feels expensive. What lingers is not pain in a sharp sense. It's a quiet thinning. Interactions that feel slightly less textured than they could be. Moments that pass without imprint. A sense that life is being navigated through compression rather than expansion. Nothing is wrong enough to demand change. Nothing is safe enough to invite release. The paradox is subtle. The strategy succeeds at what it was built to do. Social injury is minimized. Volatility stays low. The autonomic system remains controlled. Yet alongside that success is a parallel outcome the circuitry was never designed to measure: the gradual absence of resonance. Connection doesn't vanish dramatically. It fades through omission, through the things that are never offered, through the versions of self that remain unexpressed because the system learned they were costly. Over time, it becomes difficult to tell whether distance is imposed from the outside or maintained from within. And still, the system doesn't register this as a problem. From its perspective, there is no threat spike, no emergency, just stability. What remains, unanswered, is whether a regulatory pattern optimized for avoiding rejection can ever accurately detect acceptance when it appears, or whether it will continue to interpret even safety through the lens of past probability. The body stays prepared, the environment stays manageable, the question stays open, not loud enough to demand resolution, just persistent enough to be felt.